you don't need to reboot Linux. This is an incredibly common phrase touted about the operating system, and it is technically true, but especially amongst new Linux users, I've noticed that it leads to way more confusion than it actually solves. Not just with people like Linus and Luke from Linus Tech Tips, but I've seen hundreds of forum posts being confused about exactly this, saying things like, I thought Linux could just be updated without having to reboot. Why is it telling me to reboot? Why are things not updating without doing a reboot? I don't understand the deal here. So let's clear this up. Besides the people who are just spreading this quote everywhere without actually thinking about what it actually means, this idea likely stems from two different places. Firstly, Windows and macOS, in many cases, when you do an update, force you to actually reboot your system. Take Windows Update, for example. Maybe you're watching some videos on YouTube, playing some games, or doing some office work, writing documents, reading emails, whatever people do in an office. And then all of a sudden, you see this little notification saying, Windows Update is finished, time to reboot the system. Would you like to delay it? Well, you can't delay it for that long because we're going to reboot the system anyway. I don't care if you're working, you're just doing a reboot. Take Linux then. You do a system update. Let's say you're on Arch Linux, Ubuntu, Pop! OS, Void Linux, Gentoo. Doesn't matter what distro you're on. You do the system update, and then the system update finishes, and then the system just keeps going. It doesn't tell you have to reboot. It just keeps going. It seems like the system is updated perfectly fine. No reboot needed. In this state, I can keep running the system for the next week, the next month, the next year even, and it's never going to tell me I have to do a reboot. It just does not care. Unless you're running certain desktop environments where they do have tools in there that do encourage you to do a reboot. I believe that GNOME does, and maybe KDE does as well. I think Cinnamon might as well. Some of the more user-friendly desktop environments do this because there are legitimate reasons why you might actually want to reboot. Even so, though, I don't know of any desktop environments that actually force you to do a reboot. It's more like a lot of them heavily encourage it, not as aggressively as something like Windows does. But even though the system will just keep running for the next year if you leave it, it's not going to be running in the state you actually expect it to be in. But more on that in just a moment. The second place where this reboot idea comes from is likely from the Linux server space, where uptime is absolutely crucial. Let's say you run a Linux server for an investing firm that, I don't know, does millions of dollars of trades in a single day. Having that server go down for an hour loses you tons and tons of money. That's not exactly the case for a regular user, though. A system like this you cannot afford to bring down just for regular maintenance updates, updating things like the kernel, for example. That's why, as of Linux kernel 4.0, a thing known as live kernel patching has existed. This is done through a Red Hat tool called Kpatch, which effectively lets you modify a kernel without having to completely reboot it. This allows for an experienced system administrator to apply things like security patches to the kernel without bringing the entire kernel down. Theoretically, anything in the kernel can be patched through this method, but making sure the kernel stays running is incredibly important because if the kernel goes, everything else on the system goes as well. There's no recovering from that. You need to reboot the system. Outside of the kernel, though, you'd want to do things like reboot your init system if that's been updated, restart every single piece of software which has been updated and has its dependencies updated, and then you should be good to go. This idea of restarting things also extends outside of doing patches as well. Yes, you can go and restart things like drivers if you need to make sure the system is going to be running, but in a lot of cases for a regular user like you and me, rebooting the system is going to have the exact same effect and is going to be quicker, and it doesn't matter if it takes like a minute or two to reboot the system. We're not losing millions of dollars by letting that happen. But what if we don't do that? What if we just go and do the system update, we don't go and do things like live kernel patching, we don't go and restart any of the software we're using, we don't restart any of our drivers, we just do the system update and leave the system running? Well, if you go and run a program like, say, NeoFetch or any of the tools that will let you see what kernel you're actually running, you're going to notice your kernel version hasn't actually changed. If you have a web browser currently open that was open before the update happened, the browser hasn't been updated to the latest version. Nothing that you're running has been updated to the latest version, everything is still running in memory. But it extends further than that. Let's say you go and open up your web browser and you keep it open, but you go and uninstall the browser. Everything in that browser that's been loaded into memory is going to keep working. The application is going to be fine until you go and close the application. Linux doesn't care. The application is not installed anymore. It's running in memory, so clearly it's perfectly fine. I've got it loaded. Who cares? This is exactly the problem you're going to face. Now, for most pieces of software, it's not a major deal. They can be restarted. The kernel, though, as I mentioned before, can't be. If the kernel goes, the system goes. And you might have out-of-kernel tree modules, things like, say, v4l2 loopback. You might have the NVIDIA drivers. You might have things like the VirtualBox guest util thingy. All of those things need to be related to the current version of the kernel you're actually running. But when you go and install a new version of the kernel, any of those kernel modules you have are likely going to be moved over to the new version of the kernel. So things like that are very likely to just stop working altogether. This is exactly the problem you're going to face. Now, for most pieces of software, it's not a major deal. They can be restarted. The kernel, though, as I mentioned before, can't be. If the kernel goes, the system goes. And you might have out-of-kernel tree modules, things like, say, v4l2 loopback. You might have the NVIDIA drivers. You might have things like the VirtualBox guest util thingy. All of those things need to be related to the current version of the kernel you're actually running. But when you go and install a new version of the kernel, any of those kernel modules you have are likely going to be moved over to the new version of the kernel. So things like that are very likely to just stop working altogether. Unless, as I mentioned, you have it currently loaded. I actually made this mistake once before a live stream. I was using v4l2 loopback for that. That was the way to mess with my camera. And my camera just refused to work. I didn't know why it wasn't working. I saw that the module was missing. I was like, why is the module missing? I have the module installed. Reboot the system, realize it's now linked to the new kernel, and I'm an idiot. Now, because there's no difference between Linux running on the server and Linux running on the desktop, all of those Linux server steps to maintain uptime are going to be available. And if for whatever reason you have like an uptime fetish, you really want to keep uptime going, you can go and apply them, waste an hour of your life every time you do a system update. But my answer here is, why should you even bother? Considering how fast modern SSDs are, or even just a mechanical hard drive, boot time is very unlikely to be, let's say, over 5 minutes at the absolute worst. And I challenge anyone in the comments to go and update, let's say, 50 packages. No, let's say 10 packages. Go and update 10 packages and reboot all 10 packages before 5 minutes occur. I guarantee you can't do it, and it's just quicker to reboot the system. Now, before I get angry comments saying, oh, I've got a 3-year uptime, how dare you tell me to just go and reboot my system? If that's what you want to do, that's fine. Go ahead, run your Linux system the way you want to run it. I don't actually care. What I do care about, though, is suggesting to new Linux users that this is something actually reasonable to do, and it's not just a better idea to just go and restart the system. Like with the aforementioned driver issues, a lot of things can just be fixed by doing a reboot. I've had so many situations over the couple of years I've been using Linux where some random program running in the background has died, and I have no idea why this function is not working on my system anymore. I could spend hours trying to fix it, but I just go and do a reboot and it starts working. Have you turned it off and on again is just a meme, but sometimes restarting is all you need to actually fix it. Personally, I've never understood the whole uptime meme anyway. Why do you want to keep your system on 24/7? I don't understand why you want to do that. It's not great for the components, and do you not have a power bill to pay? Like, I don't want to leave my system running 24/7. That's just going to make me pay more money for literally no reason. Turn your system off, it's gonna be fine. Maybe you just have infinite money for new parts, and maybe you have full solar and don't have a power bill anyway, but Besides that, I just don't understand it. In my case, the way I handle it is I'll usually do at least one power cycle a day. I will turn my system off at night, and I'll turn it on again in the next morning. If I do a system update during the day, I'll do a reboot directly after that, and then we're good to go. The only time I leave my system on overnight is when I want to do things like really long renders, and maybe it's the video I want to upload the next day or something like that. That's the only case, but usually that's not a big deal. I'll just render just before I upload. Sometimes it's a bigger video though and I need that extra time. So let me know what your thoughts are on the whole reboot idea down below. Do you reboot your system after a system update? Do you not? You just let the system run without being updated properly? Or do you actually spend that time to make sure the updates are actually applied and then go about the rest of your day? I would love to know. So if you like this video and you want to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon subscribers early bearer pay linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays where I live stream twice a week, upload 5 YouTube shorts, and this channel is also available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.